the chaotic final days of World War II, as Allied forces pushed deeper into Germany, countless stories of bravery, desperation, and moral complexity unfolded. Amidst the rubble and the roar of battle, one particular encounter stands out, a poignant snapshot of the human cost of conflict. It's the story of a British officer who stumbled upon a German nurse, a prisoner of war, tied to a post. Around her neck was a sign, crudely scrawled with a single damning word, "Traitor." This wasn't a scene from a movie. It was a real event, documented in the annals of history, a moment that forces us to question our preconceived notions of loyalty, duty, and humanity. Who was this woman? What had she done to earn such a harsh judgment from her own countrymen? And what happened when the enemy she was trained to fight became her only hope for salvation? Our story begins in April 1945. The war in Europe was drawing to a bloody close. The Allied armies were advancing relentlessly, liberating towns and capturing vast numbers of German soldiers. Among the British units was a young officer, let's call him Captain Miller, a man who had seen more than his fair share of the horrors of war. His unit was tasked with securing a recently captured area, which included a makeshift German field hospital that had been hastily abandoned. As Miller and his men moved through the chaotic scene, overturned beds, scattered medical supplies, the lingering smell of antiseptic and fear, they heard a faint sound. It was a soft, almost imperceptible cry. Following the sound, they moved past the main building to a small courtyard at the back. And that's where they saw her. A young woman, no older than her early 20s, was bound to a wooden post. She wore the uniform of a German nurse, but it was torn and stained. Her face was pale and streaked with dirt and tears, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and exhaustion. Hanging from her neck was that rough, hand-painted sign, "Traitor." The German soldiers who had been at the hospital were now prisoners of war themselves. When Miller's men brought them over, their reactions were cold, their faces hard. They spat on the ground near her, their eyes filled with contempt. Through an interpreter, Captain Miller demanded to know what was happening. Why was this nurse being treated this way? The answer he received was chilling. The German soldiers claimed she was a traitor because she had given medical aid to a wounded Allied pilot who had been shot down nearby, according to their rigid wartime ideology, helping the enemy. Even a wounded and helpless one was the ultimate act of betrayal. She had prioritized her duty as a nurse, her oath to preserve life over her national allegiance. For this act of compassion, her own comrades had condemned her. They had tied her to the post as a public shaming, intending to leave her for whatever fate awaited her when the battle shifted. Captain Miller stood there, looking from the defiant faces of the German soldiers to the desperate eyes of the young nurse. He was a soldier, trained to fight and defeat the very people who now stood before him as prisoners. Yet what he saw wasn't an enemy combatant. He saw a fellow human being punished for an act of profound humanity. The war had created a world where kindness was seen as a crime. Without a moment's hesitation, Miller walked over to the nurse. He took out his knife and, with a single, decisive motion, cut the ropes that bound her. She slumped forward, her legs too weak to hold her. He caught her, steadying her as his men looked on in silence. He then tore the sign from her neck and threw it to the ground. He ordered one of his medics to attend to her immediately, to give her water and check for injuries. The captured German soldiers watched this unfold, their expressions a mixture of shock and disbelief. An enemy officer was showing more compassion to one of their own than they had. In that moment, the lines of battle, of us versus them, became blurred. It was a powerful, unspoken lesson in the midst of unimaginable destruction. The nurse, whose name was later recorded as Anna, was taken into Allied care. She was initially treated as a prisoner of war, but the circumstances of her capture were unique. Captain Miller made sure to file a detailed report explaining the situation and advocating for her. He argued that her actions were not those of a traitor, but of a medical professional adhering to the highest principles of her calling, the very principles recognized by the Geneva Conventions, which dictate that medical personnel must provide care to the wounded, regardless of their side. Anna's story spread through the Allied ranks. It served as a stark reminder of the ideological fanaticism that had gripped many in the German army. Even in the war's final days, for many soldiers like Captain Miller, who were weary of the endless fighting. Her story was a small but significant symbol of the humanity that could and must endure, even in the darkest of times. What became of Anna after the war? Records are sparse, as is common for many individual stories from that tumultuous period. It is believed she was eventually processed as a displaced person and, given the circumstances, was likely released without being held in a long-term POW camp. Her act of compassion, which had almost cost her her life, ultimately became her salvation. She had chosen her conscience over her orders, and in the end, that choice was vindicated. And what of Captain Miller? He survived the war and returned home, but like many of his generation, he rarely spoke of his experiences. The memory of the young nurse tied to a post, however, was one that stayed with him. It was a defining moment, a stark illustration of the moral choices that war forces upon individuals. It wasn't about grand strategies or famous battles. It was about a simple act of decency in a world gone mad. This story forces us to think. What is true loyalty? Is it blind obedience to a flag or an ideology? Or is it loyalty to a higher principle, to our shared humanity? Anna, the German nurse, made her choice. She chose compassion. The German soldiers who tied her up made their choice. They chose ideology. Captain Miller, the British officer, made his choice. He chose to recognize and honor Anna's humanity. In the grand narrative of World War II, the story of one nurse and one officer is just a footnote. But it's in these small personal stories that we often find the most profound truths. It reminds us that history is not just made by generals and politicians, but by ordinary people faced with extraordinary choices. It's a testament to the fact that even when surrounded by hatred and conflict, a single act of kindness can shine through, a flicker of light in the overwhelming darkness. The sign may have labeled her a traitor, but history and the actions of a compassionate enemy would remember her as something else entirely, a hero. A quiet hero who reminded everyone that our first duty is not to a nation or a uniform, but to each other. Thank you so much for watching. If you found this story as moving as I did, please like this video and subscribe to our channel for more hidden stories from history. We love digging up these forgotten moments that tell us so much about who we were and who we can be. Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Till next time, stay curious.